Let's talk about our topic for tonight, Google's international bloopers. And I'll introduce the rock stars we're going to speak tonight. Mark Davis co-founded the Unicode project and has been president of the Unicode Consortium since its incorporation in 1991. That was shortly after IMUG was founded. And Yuan Ho back there, our chairman emeritus, was hosting people on, talking about Unicode when nobody knew what it was. And they used to, all of this was down in just like a little piece of Xerox paper posted on bulletin boards around Stanford. The rest of Mark's bio here tells me that he is one of the key technical contributors to the Unicode specifications. He founded and was responsible for the overall architecture of international components for Unicode, ICU, and also architected the core of the Java internationalization classes. Say that 3 times fast. And he also founded and is the chair of the Unicode Common Locale Data Repository, CLDR. I could go on, but he's done some good work. Our first speaker will be Luke Swartz. You're first, right? And Luke has got a BS in symbolic systems and an MS in computer science from Stanford. He served as a nuclear submariner in the U.S. Navy, and if he's got patience for that, I think he can put up with this group. And he's also been a divisional and project manager on that submarine, the USS Ohio, and Shore Command, commander of submarines, Europe and Africa. But since 2010, he's been a project manager for Google's internationalization team, where he's worked on various projects involving language in Google products and the Plural Gender API. And I do want to thank Luke for helping us put this together, and also Reem Yazigi and the entire Google I18N intergrouplet, without whom we would not have this room or this event or that good food. Let's hear it for the food. Thank you. Okay, now I'll turn it over to Luke. You don't need this one, right?
Yeah, I'll probably use this one. All right, thanks very much, Joe. I was joking with someone that's sort of like, being the opening act for, some big band. Mark's kind of the star here. But so my initial talk here is about what we called international bloopers. So this is a talk that we gave internal. This is a slightly different version of a talk we gave internally to train engineers and localization and internationalization people at Google about it's mostly a lighthearted look at things that we screwed up over the last couple of years. And in some cases, they're just funny things, but in some cases, they're things that we can learn from. And many of them are lessons I'm sure that you've seen before, but it helps to be reminded of them. And this might give you some interesting examples you can give your colleagues that maybe aren't in the industry. So you can say, hey, even Google screwed this up, and we don't want to make the same mistake. So I'm going to start with an example that's not from Google, though, if I can get this going. So this is a very popular restaurant, the Translate Server Error restaurant. And it turns out it's a chain. There's another one of this. Now this is not a Google example. This is Google Translate does not give this particular error, but this is the perils of machine translation, which we'll get to in a second. All right, so this is the island of Samos, Greece. Does anyone here read Greek? Can anyone read what it says there? Oh, good. Yes, MACGYVER. That says MACGYVER. All right. So how did this happen? The source of this was Wikipedia. So much of our data on a lot of the Google properties, including maps, comes from Wikipedia. And someone had vandalized the Samos page to change the name to MACGYVER. And if you're familiar with Wikipedia, normally this kind of vandalism doesn't last long, maybe an hour at most. But we happened to be scraping it right when that happened, and we do run it through an algorithm normally that checks for vandalism. But something was wrong with that algorithm. Where, in fact, I think it was the opposite, where the bits got flipped. Where when it thought it was vandalism, it thought it wasn't, and vice versa. So there was a bug in that code. So as a result, it ended up on you notice it's on desktop, on Google Earth, and on mobile. we were showing MACGYVER for at least a few days and ended up in the Greek press and all that. It was pretty funny. So, this is, again, it's not strictly speaking a localization, internationalization problem, but it does show you the dangers of just scraping things without some kind of a check for it. All right, so this was an example from Google Calendar. So there's anyone here use Google Calendar? Yeah, okay, so this is a feature, I don't know if you're familiar with it, where you can find a time for a meeting automatically if you're having a meeting with more than one person. And in Spanish, we translate it as encontrar un hueco. So does anyone know what that means in Chile? Do you know?
Well, not in Chile.
In Chile? Yeah, sort of find a hole in the schedule, right, is kind of what it means. Well, in Chile specifically, it means like sort of sexually find a hole, right? So we had these blog posts about, what is this, Google porn, so it was, so, and it shows you in most other, like in Iberian Spanish and most other Latin American locales, this isn't a problem. This is sort of, it makes sense, but specifically in Chile, this was a idiomatic use there. So it shows you that, we recently launched in many of our properties Latin American Spanish, but even within Latin American Spanish, there's many dialects, and many of those dialects have little sort of pitfalls that you can fall into. So this is another thing, and I'm sure that no company gets everything perfectly localized into every dialect, but it's something you have to look out for. And you can imagine it's difficult to hire someone that's familiar with all the Latin American dialects that can catch this stuff ahead of time, right? So this is an example of when Wen Jiabo visited Malaysia. So I don't know if anyone here's, it's kind of blurry, but I don't know if there's any native Chinese speakers here. But basically, this is the translated "Welcome to Wen Jiabo, the Prime Minister of China." But it's very awkwardly translated. I'm not a native Chinese speaker, but I've been told it's something like "Welcome His Honorable Prime Minister China." Like it's sort of like it's not quite grammatical. And when they looked into it, they found out that it's exactly what you get if you type it into Google Translate. So they basically just did a straight machine translation and put it on this big flyer right behind when he arrived in the country. So, this is obviously a bad example of when to use unedited machine translation, when a head of a foreign government comes to visit you. A similar example, so this is an article, what's funny about this one is it's an article about when to use and when not to use machine translation that someone wrote, that an L10N professional wrote. But then the editor of the magazine decided to add some graphics, and they added this. So does anyone know what this says? Yeah?
Brings your family back to life?
No, it's not quite that. No, this says it's supposed to be lost in translation, but it actually says lost in Tokyo. Yeah, because this is Tokyo, right? So how did this happen? Well, it turns out, once again in Google Translate, if you type in lost in translation, it gives you the equivalent, which is the name of the film Lost in Translation, which is Lost in Tokyo, right? So similar kind of problem there. So yeah, so again, sort of both of these examples are, what's particularly ironic about this one is there's a whole article about when to not use machine translation, and obviously the editor of the journal didn't actually read the article. So, right, so this is from Riga, the capital of Latvia, and this is their monument. I think it's called the Victoria Monument. So this is a monument. It predates the Soviet era, but it's sort of a very nationalistic monument. It's seen as like a symbol of Latvian independence. And if you look on, or if you used to look on Google Maps, the label for it was written in Russian. Right, so here, again, it's not strictly speaking a monument to celebrate their independence from the Soviet Union, but it sort of has taken on that meaning, and and this is again an example where it came from Wikipedia, and we just weren't doing very good language resolution. That especially if someone's viewing maps using Latvian, there's no reason to show Russian stuff, even if it ranks higher on Wikipedia, right? So. And this is one of those things that we continue to work on is better language preferences at Google, and I can talk your ear off about it after the talk if you like, what we're doing to try and fix that. So this is an example from Swedish. So I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I think it's anvisningar is how we translated get directions. I don't know if anyone's a Swedish speaker here, but basically that means in Swedish get instructions. So this is a good example of when the importance of having good string descriptions when you're going to outsource translation through a vendor, right? Because the vendor just sees get directions, and if you think about it, get instructions is more or less synonymous for that. But in the context of this is getting driving directions or transit directions, obviously directions and instructions mean very different things. So when we switched this from instructions to the correct translation, we had, I think it was like 50% higher click-through rate on this feature. So it shows you the big impact of getting translations right as well. This is sort of two examples in one. So this is from a French version of YouTube. And if you look up in the upper right there, it says envoyer une vidéo. And so the first problem, obviously, is that it's expanded to beyond the length of the text field. So sort of a bad ITN problem. But then also, envoyer in French means to send a video, which sort of implies that you would be sharing it with your friends. But this is the upload page. So when they changed it to ajouter une vidéo, which means to add a video, again, they saw click-through rates go up a lot. So this is sort of two problems in one. You know, not quite getting the context right, but also that the length of the string or the length of the text box wasn't appropriate for all locales. So this is from Hungary. I don't know if there's any Hungarians here or anybody. All right. So one of Rims and my fellow sort of volunteers in the intergroup is Hungarian, and he pointed out this one. So this is one of the two Hungarian national days, and in English they're both called Hungarian National Day. But in this case, it's from the 1956 revolution. But this particular day, which is the March 15th, is to celebrate the 18-something, I forget the exact, I think it's 1890-something revolution, because they had two different revolutions that have two different national days. So it's basically the equivalent of Hungarian of like on the 4th of July saying Happy Memorial Day, you know, just sort of just the wrong holiday altogether. And in this case, it's because this is one of those examples where one phrase in English corresponds to two different phrases in a foreign language, right? And you could think of probably other examples that are the opposite, right? So when we have this sort of, you know, when there's not a one-to-one relationship, it's not easy to get it right. Does anyone spot anything wrong with this map? So what do you? Yeah, so you notice right in the middle. So this is outside of Montgomery, Alabama, and right at the intersection of those two highways, there's a label in Arabic, and it turns out this happened all over Google Maps. So there we had conspiracy theorists on the internet claiming that Google was trying to advance Sharia law, and so what happened? And my favorite example, there was a comment on a blog about this one that said, "Well, it is Alabama." So what happened here was there was a bug in our labeling system where if it didn't know what label to show, it just defaulted to the first one on the list. Well, what's the first language on the language list? Well, Arabic, because it starts with an A, right? So therefore, you know, not just in the U.S., but many other countries, just random Arabic labels started appearing, and until they fixed that bug. So again, sort of a interesting one there. This is another interesting one. I don't know if anyone can read. It's kind of fuzzy here, what this says here.
Yeah, I mean,
So what does it say?
it says, I'm not sure about the first one. Sabbat is basically Saturday. Mutawassit is medium, but then takbir is like enlarging.
Yeah, so it's supposed to be small, medium, large, but instead it was Saturday, medium, large, right? So, and there's also I think the Chinese version of this was Sunday, Monday, large, right? So this is another example, you know, where again, in this case, I think the programmer did what they were supposed to do, which is spell it out in the string description. In this case, the translator was hasty and didn't actually look at the description. So, but you know, it sort of shows you the importance of LQA. And yeah, this is the Chinese example where it's a similar thing. This is another example from our mobile browser for Turkish. So in this case, they were told sort of, you have to take up exactly the same amount of space that the English does. And as you know, languages don't work that way. So in this case, they abbreviated every single word in a sentence. So it's sort of like saying, this is a sentence, right? You know, like you can barely make out what it means, because every single word is abbreviated. So, yeah. So, you know, this, you know, it sort of shows you, you know, you can't make unreasonable demands on translate. I don't know who told the translator to do this, but, right. It doesn't even, yeah, right. So let's see, and then this is sort of a transitional one. So any Russian speakers here? So basically, for a long time on web search, if you notice on our web search results on the left side, you can filter by time period. You can say, hey, I want to see results from the last 24 hours or last 3 days, that kind of thing. So in this case, for Russian, we were abbreviating as last 3 da, sort of like not days, because the fully inflected version of days would change based on the number. So there was no way to get that right, so we would just abbreviate it. So it would drop the inflection. So now I'm going to turn over the baton here to my colleague Mark Davis, who's going to explain how we tried to fix this.
Thanks, Luke. Okay. So what's the plurals problem? The plurals problem is the case where you say you have 1 emails. And you've all seen this. You've all seen cases where somebody put the S in parentheses. It doesn't really work very well for English, and it gets worse for other languages. So let's go through this. The key problem is we have a placeholder. So someplace this sentence is being composed using a placeholder, which is a number which can have an arbitrary value, and the rest of the sentence. Now it's being correctly substituted in, but it's not making the changes on the rest of the sentence that it needs to do in order to work right. So you've got lots of workarounds. People put the S in parentheses. We recommended for a long time that you sort of make it a form style. You say number of emails : 1, which can sound really kind of awkward depending upon how you're doing the rest of the text. It gets worse than that. Alice added 1 context to his address book. Okay, you want to sound natural. If you want to sound natural, you've got to be able to use things like pronouns. And so these placeholders are changing. Alice, the fact that Alice is female means that his ought to be her. And once again, we have the same problem with the number in context.
The gender you get from the profile?
I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, I got to have a reveal this. So what do? We actually started working some time ago on this, on a plurals and gender API. We did this for a large part through the open source ICU project. And what this plural and gender API does is it provides for parallel translation of messages, all of the different forms of the messages that we need in order to handle plurals and gender. And it handles the complex plural rules that you find in lots of different languages. It also handles personal gender rules. Now, what it doesn't do more than 1 plural in a sentence. That's actually not a technical limitation of the software. That's actually a limitation on our translators. Because we found that if you show them more than 1 plural in a sentence, their minds just start to fry. It gets very complicated. It does not do gender of objects. So if I have, if I'm using, for example, German, where a gas station is feminine, it's not going to know that a gas station is feminine, and it's not going to use the right forms. And it doesn't do declensions. So let's dive a little bit into plurals. And in English, plurals are really very simple. You learn singular and plural, but one of the key things that we're looking at is, for us, plurals are whatever you have to do in order to make the rest of the sentence flow naturally. So in some cases, they don't exactly match to plurals or gender as you think about it when you learn a language. So for English, we end up with really 3 cases, because it's important to be able to say sometimes no people, no days, or so on. So we have, in this case, 0 days, 1 day, and other, which is plural, is 2, 3, 4, and so on. Well, in a lot of other languages, it's much more complicated. Okay, Ukrainian, you end up with these forms for 0, 1. You also have the 1 category, which includes lots of things that end with a 1, but are not identical to 1. So if you think about it a little bit, it's kind of like first, second, third in English. It kind of skips over. You don't say, you say 11th. You don't have an ST on the 11th, but then you go to 21, 22, and so on. So it works a little bit like that in a lot of Slavic languages. So there's a category 1, which is used for this these successive versions. A category few, which covers 2, 3, 4, 22, 23, 24, and so on. And then there's an other case. And notice how much the different forms of day differ. Arabic is the worst that we have. Arabic, we end up having to have 6 forms, 6 different categories to use. And apparently, according to the people that we talk to, the situation is actually even worse than that in classical standard modern Arabic, but people are used to using, being restricted to those 6 forms. So we dodged a bullet there. Okay, there are lots of different plural rules. This chart shows you and it's hard to read. I'm just going to give you an impression of it. It shows you the different plural rules for the languages for which data we've collected. So there are at least, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, say a dozen different patterns that different languages use, and these are just for the languages that we have so far. Okay, so let's drop to genders. Genders is a little bit simpler. We have 3 genders, and it's not because we're in the Bay Area. We have female, we have male, and we have other. And other is used in 2 circumstances. One is we don't know. The person has declined to state. The other is the person has decided they don't want to reveal that information. So there are 2 kinds of situations where we're just going to not be able to know. And in that case, we still have to show some kind of message. Now, in some languages, that message will default to male. In English, there's a workaround. You can use the plural. In other languages, there are various other sorts of workarounds. We supply that 3rd case so that people can deal with it, so our translators can deal with it. Now, these can all nest with the plural rules so that we can have person added number contacts to the appropriate his, her, or their address book. The other thing is this can be used for more than just gender. Once we released this internally, we found people were using it for things like selecting between short and long messages. A key is that the message is all bundled together for translation. And there's otherwise not a guarantee that the same translator will translate the same message or all the different forms. So this way, the developer can be sure that the same translator will see each of the different forms of the messages so that if he has a short and long version, those are going to be translated by the same set of eyes, and you're not going to get gratuitous differences. So when to use gender? The first condition that we have is you have to know the person's reported gender. The second condition is that we have to tell the developer is if you directly reference a person. So John did X, check out her profile, you're the only participant. Now in English it doesn't make any difference. But in French, for example, you'll use participant with an E on the end or not, depending upon whether the you is masculine or feminine. You also view the user's library. The user might be male or female, then you can make that distinction. What's a little bit trickier is there are indirect references to a person. So there are a number of languages where if we say, look at the photos, we're going to use different construction than whether the person that you're asking to look is male or the person you're asking to look is female. Welcome is another one. There's an implied, we're welcoming you. And in some languages, you'll use a different word depending upon whether you're talking to a male or a female. So what does the developer write? The developer writes as normal, a string description. And some of this is abbreviated because what we do is we also include a URL in here to give the translator some instructions on using this sort of thing. Then in this case, the syntax is, this is in JavaScript. And so the developer would write message equals Google get message, and then a certain sort of syntax that bundles everything together. So in this case, he's got the equal 0 case, the equal 1 case, and the other case. Now the developer can actually put in more if it sort of makes sense for the particular circumstance that he or she is working on. So the result is you get a call at some point in the program with some of the parameters, and the final result is you have 5 emails in read items. Okay, our requirements are we actually have people put the literal string ICU syntax into the string description. That's mostly for our tooling. That lets us, as we're going through the whole translation process, that lets us find these messages. It lets us know how many there are in the system. It lets us double check and see, well, if ICU syntax occurs, then the message had better be in ICU syntax, so we can check that and give people errors if it's not. And vice versa, we also check every message to see if it is in plural or gender syntax, and it's missing that tag, then we also log an error as well. And the English developer has to put in the 0 and 1 forms for exactly 0 and exactly 1, and has to put in other. So here's a translated example. So the original source is up on the top, and you see the example in Serbian below. One thing that you'll notice is that you'll see different forms depending upon whatever the user's language is. So in this case, the 0 form and the 2 form are not used in Serbian, but the 1, few, many, and other forms are used in Serbian. Now, right now, we've got a bit of a hack. We have the way in which we send translations out means that they go to software that's not controlled by Google. And so we end up having to fluff this up into all the possible forms. And then we have a widget that we tell the translators to look at that will say which forms to ignore. So we tell them, okay, if you're Serbian, the widget will tell you, well, don't fill in the 0, don't fill in the 2. We're not going to look at those. And the developer can also put in and say, well, I'm never going to tell the user that he has no friends. Okay, so in that case, I would just put in unused plural form, and it'll never get translated either. Okay, so it gets actually a little bit more complicated too. There's an example with a remainder. So what we also do is we also say, well, there's some circumstances where I want to say John and Fred and Tom and 5 other people did X. And in those cases, we end up having this offset parameter. And so I can say, well, I want to have even more messages because I want to explicitly mention up to 3 people and then have the escape cases for the other ones. So there's this offset parameter, and the offset parameter in this case, I'm using an offset of 1. Typically, we don't use more than, I think we use maybe 2, sometimes 3, something like that, offsets, because you will end up with more and more messages for people to translate. And I mentioned that you can have plural and gender, and this is one of the reasons why we don't allow multiple plurals in messages, is because you get the cross product of these things. So if you have a female, male, and other, and you also have a person, that's typically the worst case we get. I think there's some messages where we actually have 3 levels deep. So you have one person, you have their gender, you have another person, you have their gender, and then you have a number in the same sentence. And that gets to be pretty big. Okay, our API supports this in C++ and Java, JavaScript. It supports it in GWIS. It supports it in something which we internally called SOI, which is also called closure templates externally. And then it's open source as part of the ICU library. So this is the original web page that you saw, and we actually got, when this went into production, it was kind of dark, and we got this email from our Russian office, and they said, oh my God, I didn't believe it when I saw this. We've been complaining about this forever, and you guys finally got it, and they were so pleased that we were actually getting the plural forms in for the first time. And it's appearing in other projects. You'll see this in Google Web Search, for example. You'll see Michelle and one other person, one plus this. And you'll see this, if you had 5 other people, then it would modify to people. So you're going to see this in more and more projects on Google. And I think it's we're ready for questions. Luke, do you want to come up? Okay, so the question is, you could have the person you're talking to will have a gender, and you could also have other people in the sentence have genders.
The object that you're talking
The object or whatever. I mean, it could be a variety of things. It could be an indirect object. But we do handle multiple genders. You can have arbitrary numbers of people whose gender are being referred. The key is that the developer just has to be able to supply that information. So I think there was a question earlier, where does that come from? Well, it can come from, for example, the user profile. So if it's someone who's logged into Google and they've exposed their gender, then we can use that in expose their, that sounds a little odd, yeah. Maybe I shouldn't use that phrase anymore.
happened to a congressman.
Yeah. Happened to a congressman, yeah, look what happened to him, yeah. Heard he resigned, so yeah. So if they reveal, no, that's not even that's not good either. Yeah, okay. If their gender is known, then we can use that. And so if John is mentioned in the sentence, and then you're working on the computer and you're logged in, and there's a sentence which gets translated, mentions John, and you're in there too in some way, we can change the sentence depending upon both of those.
Also do it based on the name.
I'm sorry? We do not do it based upon the name itself. I mean, you can't, that would be speculative. Okay, you don't know that Jackie is a male or a female. It becomes, yeah. There's there are too many cases where and the same name actually across languages. In some cases, the name is strongly male, and the same name would be strongly female in another language. So you can't really do that. Yeah. Question?
Yeah. So the examples that you've given all seem to be showing non-negative integers. It says your domain. So let me ask a little bit about the domain of things that you can agree with in number.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll ask several flavors of this question, and you can answer them all together. One of them is written word number. So it's
Well, you know, if you ask a long, complicated question, I'm not going to be able to repeat it on the video. So if you can break it up into small pieces.
First question, I'll ask all the questions you can repeat and you can answer. So one of them is spelled out numbers. So O-N-E versus the number one.
So the question is, what do we do about O-N-E versus the number 1?
Can you deal with that?
And currently, that's a restriction, as we depend upon the number being expressed as a series of digits. Now, it doesn't have to be Western digits. It could be Arabic digits, could be Indic digits, and so on, but it has to be a series of digits. There is facility in ICU for doing number spell out, but that tends to inflect, and we're not prepared to handle those inflections.
Okay. Then the second issue is two kinds of fractions, decimal fractions and common fractions. So, and the interesting thing there is you can have exactly the same value, and in one way it's plural and singular. So you can have a half day singular, 0.5 days plural.
Okay, so the question is, how do we handle fractions, including the fact that there are differences between decimal fractions and rationals?
Yeah.
Okay. What we do right now is all of the message, the body of messages that we're primarily concerned with are integers. We do have some support in for fractions, decimal fractions. Actually, the problem even comes up with decimal fractions. Because take in English, you'll say the modern American family has 1 child per family. But you'll tend to say the modern American family has 1.0 children per family. So even though it's exactly the same value, we tend to use the plural when we've got a decimal, even if it's the same thing. And as you mentioned, there's a problem with 1/2 versus 0.5. We're looking right now at that, and it turns out to be fairly tricky. Fractions, for example, in Serbian, what you tend to do is you tend to take the last number that's mentioned and use that to key it off, except where you've got 2, and then you take the 2 as if they're, if you take .21, for example, you treat it as if it was 21. So you get 1.11 will take the same form as 11 does. Okay. So the fractional rules get really kind of tricky, and we were looking at those, but our primary focus initially has been integers and positive integers, well, non-negative integers. Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, I was kind of always wondering. I have kind of some experience with working with linguists on various of these issues, and honestly, I mean, I think lots of different kind of feedbacks from that. I mean, sometimes you give a kind of just one random string, and they actually try to translate it in a kind of the most neutral way, and sometimes they really kind of come back and nag at us that we need to split it, and then we split it for them, and they actually kind of get really confused when we actually go and split it for them. So it's just really kind of basically asking, but it's my experience is more limited number of linguists on these things. So you probably have much more linguists in this. So horror stories or experiences with linguists.
Yeah, we can mention what Daniela said.
That's a
yeah.
good point.
Yeah, so one of our sort of people that helps manage our translation vendors said that when he first rolled this out, so he's the one that does it for Italian, they didn't believe him. They were like, no, you just want us to write it as number of emails colon number, right? I mean, because there's no way to translate it properly. And he's like, no, look, there's 3 different versions, so you can translate it properly. And they were like, wow, we've never seen this before. So it is a bit of a shift, right? And the translation industry isn't used to this, at least not yet. So it does require a significant amount of training, and we still get errors, sometimes pretty substantial ones. But eventually people sort of get it. And that's the key that Mark was saying, is that they're all parallel translations, so that the same translator is looking at all 3 versions. You know, it's not enough to split it. You also need all split versions to go to the same person, because otherwise it'll look like it's written by a sort of ransom note writing, where, you know, when it's 2 people, it's one phrase, and then when it's 3 people, it's written another way, and it'll be even worse than if you just kept it the old way, you know.
Yeah. We did tweak the format a lot as we went along to help the translators. I mean, the actual technology of formatting the message and so on pales beside getting this to all flow through the whole translation mechanism from start to finish and back without errors. So for example, if you look at this originally, I mean, the technology supports having the thing that's nested be actually in parts. You can actually nest any part of a sentence arbitrarily in the format. But we ended up, after working with translators and so on, deciding, well, we're just going to enforce that every single version is a complete sentence. And every single version you will have, even though it's not necessary to show all of these forms, it's not necessary to always have 0 and 1. We enforce that on the developer because we found there were just too many mistakes if you give people too much freedom. Okay, if it's a very sort of set pattern, then they can learn to deal with it. If they have too many options, then it all falls apart. Yeah. A new question back here. Yeah.
Now that you've donated this to have any insights into what tools, what common tool sets are planning to incorporate support for it?
So the question is, now that we've donated this to ICU, the question is what tool sets are planning to incorporate it? I think, well, first I want to say that this is the plural and gender support. A lot of this came out of work that was already being done in ICU and being done by other participants in ICU. So for example, the selection support, which became gender, that was contributed by Yahoo, for example. So I don't want to give the impression that we originated all of this. The second thing is which systems are, or which tooling is going to incorporate this. Well, I assume Yahoo is going to incorporate part of it since they donated some. It really varies. I mean, we don't, in ICU, we don't keep track of who's using which things for what. Inside of Google, we can query and we can find every single code instance of anybody who's using this stuff, and we know every single message that's being translated with it. But of course, we don't quite have that same freedom outside of Google.
Are you exposing it in GTK or Google in your language?
We are exposing it, let me see, I think it will go into Google in your language just naturally. I believe it'll go into that. It is being supported in GTT. It's being supported in GWT, which a lot of people use. So I expect this and more support to appear
The
over
closure
time.
tools as well, the soy.
Closure
yeah.
tools,
Yeah.
so people are adopting it.
The closure templates. Yeah.
I mean, the closure templates, it turns out to be, it's very easy to implement if you, it's very easy to implement as a standalone function that a developer calls. It's a little more work if you're doing a template language, like the closure templates, where you have to, where if you want to really integrate it in more deeply, then you want to make some syntactic changes in whatever your template language is. Okay, just a second, I think.
Well,
Tex?
so maybe you could say a little bit about the effect on your localization costs, because now that you're greatly expanding the number of strings, what does that do to your schedule and costs, and have you gotten any pushback yet for, well, okay, now that you've multiplied it, what can we do to bring it back in?
Well, we have had to increase training. It does take more time for the linguistic Q&A. We've tried to focus the use of these where they are the most important, where they're sort of the most natural, the most common messages that people are using, where it could depend upon it. And so we're rolling it out as we go. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I guess you make a good point that, by splitting each, like you saw in the plurals, particularly in Arabic, you're splitting from translating one phrase to 6. So you've just, multiplied your localization cost by 6 times. So that was sort of a known issue when we went in. What's frustrating for the translators, at least initially, was, hey, it's not only more words, but it's also more work for me to figure out how to do this. At least the first few times. Once they get the hang of it, it's not so bad. But there's some ramp up cost, and that they were kind of complaining, hey, we're not getting paid anymore. We're still getting paid by the word, because that's sort of the standard in industry, is just pay by the word. So.
You get paid 6 times?
They would get paid 6 times, but just they don't get paid, because they would argue not only is it 6 times the work, it's really 12 times the work, because it takes me a long time to figure out how this syntax works, right?
Yeah,
so
the first
that was
time,
the first time you do it.
The first time you do it,
there's some ramp up costs, right? So we did get some complaints about that, but I think in general, at least our localization management team really loves this, because it solves a problem that they had been having to deal with for a long time. And there's really no good way to solve this in many cases. So like Mark said, especially for where it's a high impact string, and it's something that really is very awkward now, that's what we've been trying to focus on. Like, obviously, if you did it for every string in your UI, then your localization cost would spiral out. But if you sort of focus it on where it's you get the most bang for the buck, literally, you might. I think that's what we've been doing. So.
And we did investigate, for example, for the plurals, and the plurals are the ones that expand a lot. We did investigate to see how many messages in Google, what proportion of those messages were plurals. And that's one of the things that convinced us that we could deal with the restriction of only having a single plural form per sentence. Is there was in all of the Google translated text there was only one message that had two numbers inserted in it, and so we were able to get by without supporting that. Okay, let me see. That's you. Yeah.
How does that affect the Asian languages? Because a lot of Asian languages.
Asian languages, as far as this is concerned, are wonderful, right? I mean, you know, we're all familiar with the problems of input and the problems of fonts and so on and so forth. But as far as plurals are concerned, they're wonderful. We love them. So what happens with Asian languages is typically the sentence will be the same. Okay, there's no difference in the sentence across when you change number, and so it's even simpler than English.
Now, like Mark said, the gender thing is just a select statement, so you could use it for things other than just gender. So in many, I know, like for example, Japanese has a number of distinctions based on politeness, that sort of thing. You know, so in that case, you could use that. You know, like you could use it for a TV distinction in like Latin, you know, and Romance languages as well. You know, so you could use it anytime you want to have parallel translations for, you know, that you want to be able to queue on some variable, right? So like Mark said, you know, for particularly plurals and also a little bit gender, like most Asian languages are, you know, the easiest ones really on our list. Yeah. But you could use it for some other things that might be trickier in Asian languages.
Okay.
Oh, with the different counting systems for Japanese? Yeah, I don't think we really handle that.
The counting systems and inflections are one of the reasons why we enforce that it's a numeric substitution. And so it's up, but it's up to the translator to find the best format, given that it's only going to be a numeric substitution. Yeah. Okay, a new face? Yes, okay, again.
You spoke about supporting other distinctions such as TV. Does that mean that you have a specific API for defining arbitrary attributes?
Well, no. We're just saying that you could use the generic capability of selecting more than one thing and having parallel translations. You would still have to work out on the developer side, when, you know, how do I know whether to use a T or a V form, right? But I'm just saying that you could use this facility to have automatic translations be parallelized and then be able to select them in runtime.
Yeah, I can't have an attribute called formality and then pass that as a string so it knows.
Yeah, I know you could have an attribute. Exactly. Just we haven't figured out how you figure out the formality attribute. Like that would be, you know, the developer would have to figure that out.
But I'll give a concrete example. I mean, we released this into the Google source base, and then lo and behold, a week or two later, we were looking at some of the messages, and somebody was using it for short versus long messages because they wanted to have basically forms of the same message in two different contexts. And in one context, they only could afford a small amount of space. In the other, they could afford a lot of space. So they would have these parallel, but they wanted to keep them parallel, but they wanted to vary according to short and long. So that's what they did, is they used the same interface. They used this, it's called a select statement. They defined their own short and long and put it in, and it worked fine. Yeah.
Regarding the numbers, I'm not exactly sure I got it. So you're saying that the actual decimal number should appear in the string for this to work fine, but that's not the case for the gender, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if the number is kind of implied from somewhere else or something.
Well, what happens is the programmer is responsible for supplying whatever information gets reflected by the format. So if the programmer knows you're logged in, you've said you're male, and we also have the information that we're talking about 3 emails that you've gotten. We've got a number variable. Then the programmer will supply the fact that you're male plus the fact that the number to be substituted is 3 into the system, and it will pick the right message based upon those 2 pieces of information.
3 decimal is not necessarily required to appear in the string.
3 in decimal currently for about the next 10 days is actually required to appear in the string in the plural form. The explicit forms, the equals 0, equals 1, and so on, it is not required. So I could say, you, Rusba, have no messages, or you, Rusba, have a message. You, Rusba, have 1, 0 messages. Okay.
So that was kind of thinking about implied messages. So something would be, yes, you have blah messages, and somebody may ask you, what should I do with these emails?
Right.
And what's actually funny, I'm thinking of Persian, but the thing is the plural rules actually may be different for when you're just having the numbers and when you don't. So,
Yes.
So if you add a number, it's, for example, for Persian, it's just always the same thing. What's East Asian languages? If you have a number, you'll always have the same form. But there are plural rules. So when you want to refer to them indirectly, you don't actually put the number in. The plural rule will have it.
Yeah, well, I was mentioning, and this is a disclosure of future progress. But I was mentioning that we are, as a matter of fact, what we first did was had a very hard and fast requirement that you had to mention the number in the English, and that you had to mention the number, the placeholder that stood for the number, in the translated version. But we're in the process of requiring that so that the developer can say, what do you want me to do with these messages?
Yes, so which brings me kind of to this other thing that, can you change plural rules, or this is just what ICU or CLDR says?
We use what CLDR says.
Okay, so for different strings, you cannot change the plural rules in places.
No, which means that what we do is we show the maximum number of forms that we've gotten feedback on that you need. Okay, if you take, for example, Slovenian, there's a dual form, but the dual form is not used with lots of words. That is, lots of words are invariant in the dual form. They're the same as the plural. But because some words are in the dual form, we end up having a dual form that a lot of cases it'll just be a copy. So the translator just takes it, copies it, boom, he's done. Okay?
It seems to me that right up there, along with gender and number, is grammatical case, especially in the context of date and time strings. And I know that this is not formally part of your talk, but what is the situation right now with ICU and CLDR as far as
support for case? Yeah. So the question is, what about, you've told me about these genders and plurals, but I don't care. What about case? Right? So I'm paraphrasing slightly. Yeah. Case is really tricky. I mean, in general, the inflection of parts of a sentence in order to deal with changes in other parts of the sentence is a very tricky problem. It's something that we've taken a look at, but it's something that we want to approach incrementally. And we looked at what we could do, and this project we get a huge bang for the buck. We would really like to be able to say, I gave this to you, Vladimir, and then Vladimir has the accusative case. Okay, but we can't do that yet.
I'm thinking just in context of simple date and time strings rather than necessarily these sentences. For instance, in September, on the 5th of September, and so forth. So just to be able to support that much would be.
Yeah, there are lots of different things we could do. I mean, there's the, if you look at, but it gets complicated very quickly. You look at Finnish and the number of forms that you have to have just for a date goes crazy. So it's something that we're looking at, but it's something that I'm not, we don't have an implementation right now. Yeah. George.
So, from the developer perspective of adopting this technology, was the adoption process more passive, of just reacting to what issues are complained about, or was it more proactive and education was provided and tools were enforcing the rules and so forth?
Yeah. So the question was. Well, let me see if I can paraphrase that. What was the whole process of getting this rolled out? It actually went back some time. We, in Google, in our group, we try to kind of lead the target. You know, we're trying to aim a little bit ahead of where the product groups are going to want to go. And so we put a fair amount of work into defining what we wanted out of plurals and gender earlier on. And then it turns out there was a project that really wanted this stuff. So we hurried up and finished up the project, at least where we had the software, and then started working with other groups to get the whole translation process in place, which took a lot of time and effort by many people throughout the company. That actually took much more effort than the basic technology did. And got it to the point where it was usable, and once we released it, people started using it almost immediately.
Yeah. In many cases, it was just people discovered the API and used it in sort of inventive ways. I think also our localization group has sort of been advocates for it as well. You know, because they know which phrases are, you know, especially badly translated in other languages. So they would go back to product teams and say, hey, you know, this phrase is really bad in this one product. What do you think about this new API? I'll hook you up with Mark Davis and he'll tell you how to use it. And you know, we got a lot of products using it for their sort of high value phrases.
Yeah, but
So-
it was definitely more of a pull rather than a push. We didn't really have to convince people to use it.
Right. I think once people learn it, they're like, oh yeah, this is good. Because even in English, you can see the benefits. But obviously in other languages, it's more of a big deal.
So there wasn't like too much people's old code that tried to figure out how to do plurals on their own that had to be replaced? Or?
No, there really wasn't. I mean, that has happened in Google's history. When I first came to Google, there were, we found 14 different functions that were doing string lowercasing. And every single one of them was wrong. So we've definitely coalesced the software a lot and standardized it a lot. But in this particular case, we didn't find people doing other approaches to plurals or gender. Craig.
I have a question about the bloopers. Aside from the native speakers for a language finding it, are there ways that they can be found automatically or reported easily?
Yeah, so the question is about how do we find these bloopers, basically, right? So there's a number of ways that we do it. So in certain cases, like I think the MACGYVER case, we found out through the press. So that's our least preferred way of finding these bloopers. But occasionally, several of the bloopers, I think a couple of them were caught during LQA, linguistic QA. So basically, that we try and run everything through a native speaker that can see everything in context and evaluate it before it runs out to public launch. So, but then there's often sort of a middle way where either external users will report things via, we have a number of different feedback bug reporting tools for external users, but also internal Googlers that just happen to speak different languages that report things. And we sort of have a number of processes in place. So one's called a language find it, where we'll get together a group of people that all speak one language. In fact, Riem just organized one, was it last week, I think, for French speakers. Yeah, so just catching all kinds of little errors that you wouldn't, unless you were, a heavy user of the product that was a native speaker of French, you wouldn't necessarily see it. So we sort of got a bunch of people in a room and, sort of made them think of their homeland and sort of, and plus it's a fun experience for the people too, because you get to, yeah, and that's true. It wasn't just here; it was in 6 different Google offices around the world participated. So there's lots of ways of catching these. One through the press, but hopefully before that. And I think it's still an unsolved problem how we can do better at it, and I think we're trying to figure out a way to measure our quality as well, so that we can sort of show, ideally even quantitatively, that we're kind of moving the bar up and making things higher quality.
We probably ought to translate Google bloopers into all of our languages and just regularly search on YouTube.
Yeah, just look for, yeah. Yeah, so, did you have a question too? Oh yeah, so you were asking about the reporting mechanism. So it depends on the product. One that we're integrating with a lot of products that began as actually a localization tool is called Google Feedback. I know that the most prominent thing I know it's launched on is YouTube. So there's a link up on YouTube where you can say report, I think it's just give us feedback, it says.
Yeah,
Or
I think it's
report an issue. No, it's report an issue, I think is usually what it says. And it's a fairly straightforward tool where you can, it's kind of neat because you can highlight where the error is. And then on our side, there's some machine learning so that we can easily classify what kind of a bug it is, that kind of thing. So we often get bugs bubbling up that way as well. So.
How robust is it in cases where you launch something and then some country tells you, oh, I need one more case, which you then add it to the English, and can that potentially break the other languages?
So the question is, what happens if we go to a language and we get reports in that, oh, well, we need another plural category, for example. I assume it's not another gender.
Well, this happened for Polish, didn't it?
No, but somebody reported that in some country you had to support like 5 genders, but I think that was apocryphal.
Right.
Yeah.
For some languages, I know I've seen a book where they say that you can have 18 genders for some language. Gender no longer means just.
Yeah, it doesn't mean the same thing. Yeah, but well, one of the things. Yeah, one of the things is we're really limited. We're really limiting it to personal gender, and of course to the languages that we support, which is about 42 standard languages. But should we decide that we find a language where you need to change inflections based upon the age of the person, that is something that we could support with another select mechanism. We'd have to look carefully at the return on investment for doing that.
So basically, adding a plural case, is it orthogonal to everything?
Oh, if we added a new, so we found out that Slovenian actually, or Slovak, does need a dual, and we thought it didn't. What that would involve doing is that would involve changing our tooling and then reissuing the messages for translation in Slovak. So we would be modifying it, we'd reissue the translations, and the way the translations work in Google is, as far as the developer is concerned, it's very much sort of turn a switch and then by magic in a couple of weeks things work. So now, of course, a lot of that, there's a man behind the box, a lot of machinery behind the box, but the translations would go out and get issued through the normal process and come back in. Yeah, but it would cause a retranslation of each of those strings for that language.
No ripple effects.
It wouldn't have any ripple effects in any other language. Yeah, and it wouldn't require the developers to do anything. Yeah. Okay, is that about the end of the questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention.